Welcome back to Utility Sports, where in today's video, we're going to talk about the Utah Jazz with a team-specific trade guide focused on what Danny Ainge and the Utah Jazz could look to do this trade deadline. There's a lot leading into this trade deadline, whether the Utah Jazz are going to be buyers, sellers, what they're going to look to do. I think that they really control the market in a lot of ways, depending on which players are available, based on who they're willing to give up, who they're willing to part with, and who they're willing to keep on their roster long term. So I think there's a lot to break down in this video. If you guys do enjoy, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more. And let's jump into it here now with a quick reminder that we're going to be live on YouTube. The date's February 6th through February 9th. Sorry for the little typo on the graphic there. Monday through Thursday for the NBA trade deadline. We will be live on the channel. So there's going to be a lot to enjoy in terms of content coming out. Also planning a mock draft for February 6th as well. So there's a lot of content. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of that. And also turn on the notification bell so you get updated when I post a new video. Let's jump into that video preview now. We're going to look at the Utah Jazz and their current record. We're going to do a little season check-in, look at how this team's been playing. Jazz fans, I'm sure you guys have been having a lot of fun. This team's been very enjoyable to watch. You know, you think about the beginning of the season, they started off super hot, and then they kind of, took a couple steps back, but they've stayed very competitive. And Lauri Markkanen is an all-star level player this year. He's been kind of at the forefront of it, but there's been a lot of other bright spots as well. It's been very exciting to watch this team this season. Also look at the long-term cap space. Is that going to be something they take into consideration when it comes to making some moves at the deadline here? Draft assets, is that a way that they could look to add more into the little cabinet that they have of draft picks already? Or would they look to maybe trade some of those draft assets? We'll look at what they exactly have. I think that's going to be a fun segment for Jazz fans to kind of reminisce on the deals from this summer. Then we'll look at their tradable players. This is the most important part of the video, looking at who they have available. And to be honest, Utah has way more players to give up than any other team in the league. They've got a lot of solid rotational players that could fit on contenders and really make a difference come playoff time for teams that are potentially looking to buy from Utah. We'll look at those potential suitors and my estimated value on what the players that the Utah Jazz are looking to trade away could potentially demand. Now, one thing about Danny Ainge, he always likes to make trades that he thinks he's getting a huge win for his organization. And the one thing I'm going to say is my value might be a little low based on that. Danny Ainge seems to squeeze every little ounce of value out of every single player he trades away. So it's possible that they get compensated a little bit more than I'm expecting, but I think for the most part, my value is kind of what I would be willing to give up for them. And I think it's kind of rationalized based on what the perceived value should be. Maybe a team does go out and give up more though to get a player. And then we'll conclude the video with projected activity level. I have a fun little title for what the Utah Jazz are going to be this season when it comes to the trade deadline, which we are only at this point 4 days away. Very excited for that. So jumping into their current record at the time I'm recording this, they're 27-27. They're 1.5 games back of fourth in the Western Conference, but they're also 1.5 games ahead of 13th in the Western Conference, which is really where we get to the question of should they buy or should they sell? What do we really think this team is? It's tough. Utah, they could go on a win streak right now. Let's say they win 3 or 4 straight games. They could jump all the way up to fourth in the Western Conference and be even a team with home advantage for the playoffs if things end well for them this season. But it's also possible that if they continue to play around 500, maybe have a losing streak in there at some point, it's possible that they could drop completely, not even just out of the playoffs, but out of the play-in tournament as well. With where they currently sit, nothing's guaranteed at this point of the season. There's a bunch of other teams that are maybe going to look to make upgrades as well at the trade deadline. The Kyrie Irving situation could completely shake up the NBA. And because of that, the Utah Jazz could find themselves in a very tough situation where, hey, maybe they do fall out of playoff contention. And because of that, then you're looking at the draft pick. And do they have a shot at Victor Wembanyama? And the answer to that right now is no. If they keep the direction that they're currently on, or if they look to add at the trade deadline, they really do not have a chance at him. For Utah, this is what I'm going to say. If I was running the show here, I would make a couple sell moves, try and position myself to move up in the lottery just a little bit. And the reason for that is when you have top 7 odds in the lottery, you think about last year, the Sacramento Kings had the 7th best odds. They end up moving up to pick number 4 in the draft. You think back to when the Memphis Grizzlies had the 8th best odds and jumped up to number 2 for John Morant. This class with 2 really top elite players. There's also guys like Amen Thompson, Ausar Thompson, Brandon Miller. That kind of rounds out the top 5 a little bit. There's a lot of talent in this draft class, and the Utah Jazz already have multiple picks. But at some point, for this whole thing to be worth it, for this team to, take the step from, wow, this team's a really, really great regular season team like we saw with Gobert and Mitchell, at some point you need the mega superstar who is going to turn Utah from a great team into an elite team, a team that can win an NBA championship. That's the whole point of trading Mitchell and Gobert, is you are thinking we're never going to win a championship with these 2 guys. Let's move off of this and go and try and find a way to be better than that down the road. Lauri Markkanen, Walker Kessler, that's already a great start. Plus you have other nice pieces. And it really comes down to what Danny Ainge wants to do. He's one of the smarter executives in the NBA. He does a great job putting teams together. I think he's got a really great eye for talent if you look at his draft history. But, I mean, you just get diminished results picking outside of the top 10. You really do. And you guys know I'm a big advocate of, hey, drafts are deep. There's a lot of talent to be had outside of the lottery even. But just with where Utah's at with their rebuild, just thinking realistically, it's 6 months after a Gobert and Donovan Mitchell trade. Their eyes should not be set on this season. And if they can somehow find a way to move up in the lottery, somehow position themselves for one of Victor Wembanyama, Scoot Henderson, Brandon Miller, I think would be a great fit here as well. Amen Thompson, one of those 4 players could completely change this organization for the better. And I think Utah should prioritize that. I really do believe that. Now, for most of these trade guides, I'm not necessarily giving my own opinion on what I think should happen, but with Utah, their current situation, I do think it's important to note, look, it's been a fun season. Lauri, Walker Kessler, 2 building block pieces for sure. But I'm just not certain that this team's going to win a ton of games, even with how great they started this year. To find themselves at 554 games in, I think is a surprise in a good way. But can you bank on that being the way that things continue to play out? Will Hardy's a great young coach, in my opinion, and I think that they need to serve him best by trying to accrue more young talent. And I think moving off of a couple pieces that make sense this year in good value deals is the best way for them to naturally find themselves moving up in the draft lottery while still staying competitive and keeping some of those long-term pieces on your roster. Which leads us into long-term cap space. As of right now, they do not have a window into long-term cap space, but as of February 10th, one day after the trade deadline, it's very possible we could see them in a situation where cap space is plentiful for them. And that's really where it gets fun, right? If they win the draft lottery, they go out and draft, say, Victor Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson, picks 1 or 2. You could also go into free agency with cap space around Lauri Markkanen, Walker Kessler, and one of those top 2 guys like we talked about. And maybe you add, some top-end talent in free agency. Now, Utah's not really been a free agency destination, but if you can offer a ton of money and you have Victor Wembanyama, Lauri Markkanen, Scoot, or Scoot Henderson, and then you also have Walker Kessler on your roster, there's going to be some interest from veterans around the league. It kind of reminds me of Bojan Bogdanovic choosing to go to Utah in free agency because of Gobert and Mitchell. That pairing was very intriguing to Bogdanovic in his decision to take a contract from Utah, and I think we could see the second coming of that if a different French setter, for example, is playing in Utah next season. So when it comes to draft assets, they do own most of their own first-round picks to Oklahoma City. I think one thing that's been overlooked is they actually do owe their 2024 first-round pick, top 10 protected, to Oklahoma City. The Thunder have a ton of draft pick rights, obviously. So Utah, they do find one asset out the door. But given their current situation, I don't think it's likely that we see them even look to include a draft pick in any deal. I just think right now is not the time to buy for this team. I'm sure most of the fans do agree with me on that as well, although I'm sure some would say, well, we're pretty good, let's try and win. I think that's very short-sighted. I don't think that Danny Ainge has his eyes set on having the sixth best record in the Western Conference for 1 year and then mitigating his long-term success. I think he's more focused on what does this team look like 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now? Are we contenders within the next 3, 4 years? I think that's really what he wants to see from this organization. And a really good point for that, and the way that they're going to be able to get there, they literally own the souls of the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Minnesota Timberwolves. They got 3 first-round picks for Donovan Mitchell. They got 4 first-round picks for Rudy Gobert plus a swap. They got some nice young players in that. Ochai Agbaji, a guy who I think that they like. He's starting to play a little bit more and more every single game lately. And then Walker Kessler's been fantastic this year. He's a lock to be all-rookie first team, in my opinion. I talked about him before the season. He was one of my favorite players in the NBA draft. I really, really liked him. You can go out and check some of my old mock drafts, some of my old draft board videos right before the NBA draft to kind of get what I thought on him. You guys are going to, it's funny because I kind of compared him to Rudy Gobert a little bit in the pre-draft process. And I think Jazz fans, you've seen some of those similarities this season. So let's get into the tradable players. And this is where, in my opinion, things are really fun. There's 7 players here I have listed, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, half of an NBA roster. That's how many valuable players. And I didn't even include Lauri Markkanen, Walker Kessler, or Ochai Agbaji, because I don't think that they trade any of those 3 players. I think those are the 3 guys that they have locked into their roster for next season, written down in pen. The rest of these guys are written in pencil. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't be open to keeping them around. Notice all of them are on 2-year deals besides Collin Sexton, who's on a 4-year deal that he freshly signed this past summer. So let's look at Mike Conley, 2-year, $47 million deal. Now it is not fully guaranteed for next year. I believe the guaranteed portion of that is $14 million next season. So a team, if they were to trade him and not keep him around, would, accrue a $14 million dead cap number, but would also save $10 million in the process. But I think if a team trades for Mike Conley, they're going to look to keep him long-term. Collin Sexton, 4-year, $71 million. Pretty solid contract, honestly, for a 6-man scoring type, especially with where the mid-level exception's headed. A little bit over $15 million a year is not bad, especially since the mid-level exception within the next 2-3 years is probably going to be up to around $12 to $13 million. So relatively, it's a pretty solid contract for somebody who has been a lethal scorer in his NBA career. Jordan Clarkson playing around $13.2 million this year, $13.3 million team option or player option, for next season. That's going to likely be declined by him. So it's very possible we see him explore free agency, which is why I think Danny Ainge will likely consider a potential move of Jordan Clarkson. I know ownership there really likes him. Ownership also really liked Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. I'm not sold on the fact that Jordan Clarkson's not going anywhere. I think that's a leverage play by the Utah Jazz. Malik Beasley, 2 years, $32 million team option. He's actually leading the NBA in bench three-pointers made this season. He shoots a ton of threes, and they're usually pretty accurate and precise. He usually makes a good amount of them. He's definitely a microwave off the bench, probably could be a starter as well for a team looking to add a little bit of shooting into a lineup. He's got pretty good size and athleticism. He's not a complete minus defensively like a lot of other shooters are in the league. You think about guys like Seth Curry, Patty Mills, 2 examples, Joe Harris, a little bit of, it seems like I'm targeting Brooklyn Nets players right now, but it's not just them. It's a lot of shooters around the league. They usually tend to give up a little bit more on defense. I think Beasley is a solid defender, not a good one or a great one, but I think he's a solid team defender. It's not like you're going to put him on the other team's best player, but I don't think he's going to get hunted as aggressively as a guy like, say, Patty Mills or Seth Curry would in postseason basketball. Rudy Gay, 2 years, $12.6 million. We'll talk about him a little bit later on. That contract's not really a positive, though, but there is some things that they can do with that in terms of including him in a trade. Jared Vanderbilt, 2 years, $9 million. The one tough thing about him is including him into a trade versus trying to trade him on his own, since he has such a low salary cap hit this year, about $4.4 million, 4.6 next season. It's hard to find good value trading him away because his contract's so small that when you have to match money, it's hard to find another valuable player on a low contract like that. So there's going to be some workarounds to that. We'll talk about that in a little bit on a future graphic. Then Kelly Olynyk, here 2 years, $25 million. That is not fully guaranteed in year 2 as well. But I know Danny Ainge really likes Kelly Olynyk. Part of trading Bojan to Detroit was intentional in bringing in Kelly Olynyk. He's a 5-man who can handle the ball a little bit, play make for others to a certain extent, more than a lot of other big men in the league can. And then, of course, we know he can step out behind the three-point line, but he's also a pretty solid driver of the basketball. I think Kelly Olynyk's one of the more polarizing players on this team, to be honest. People who, if you watch him really closely, like you end up getting like kind of tired of some of the stuff he does. But if you watch him from afar, you're like kind of intrigued by that, which is why some teams could maybe sniff around Kelly Olynyk this trade deadline. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the value and suitors for these players. Let's start with Mike Conley, the veteran on this team, well into his 30s at this point. There's some teams that I think would sniff around a point guard. The Clippers, I really think, could use one. He's a significant upgrade, in my opinion, over Reggie Jackson, although likely at this point being a little bit less athletic, maybe a little bit less skilled. He's a better offensive player, especially in terms of fit. The Clippers need somebody who can run an offense. I don't believe Reggie Jackson can do that. I think Mike Conley can, which is why he's a significant upgrade. I think the Timberwolves had interest, especially when D'Angelo Russell was kind of struggling. You think November, December of the season, but then D'Lo had a very good January. He shot 49% from 3, making it less likely to see him get traded. But you never know. Things happen at the trade deadline. I want to include the Timberwolves as a team to watch. The Mavericks and Heat, I think both of those teams kind of find themselves in similar situations where they're just not happy with point guard play, especially outside of their stars. So when Jimmy and Bam have the ball for Miami, they're happy with what's going on offensively. Kyle Lowry's been really not great since they've signed him. And then for the Mavs, obviously Luka, Dinwiddie, you know what you're getting, but I think they're missing that third ball handler like we saw last year. Dinwiddie has ascended into that Jalen Brunson role that he was playing in Dallas. So I think the acquisition of Mike Conley would almost be a new Dinwiddie on the roster, coming off the bench, trying to lead the second unit a little bit. And I think there'd be some value there. To get him, it'd be a very protected future first-round pick. I'm talking, maybe top 18 protected, top 20 protected. You're not going to get a good first-round pick for Mike Conley at this time, or 2 to 3 second-round picks. Of course, you're going to also have to match money in there. So that's where, if you're giving up somewhat of a bad or not great contract, that's where a future first likely has to be involved. But just with where Utah's at right now, I think some teams need to play hardball with Danny Ainge. You just can't be willing to, bow over and give Danny Ainge whatever he wants. Like, again, from my perspective, Utah staying as a middling team is not a great outcome for them. I don't think having the 11th best lottery odds and maybe losing in the play-in tourney is a great outcome for them. I really don't. I don't think it's best for their long-term future. I don't think that it has a lot of positives in terms of what this team's going to become 3 years from now. So you kind of have to call Danny Ainge's bluff a little bit and say, okay, you can keep Mike Conley, keep winning games. That's fine with me. Mike Conley, yes, it's about improving your own team, but you also have to take your long-term consideration in. You just can't be willing to give up an arm and a leg in a deal with Danny Ainge, like teams seemingly are always willing to do for whatever reason. He only makes trades that he really likes, but other teams have to be willing to do that as well. And I think that's the one thing that gets lost in translation is teams start to pursue a player that Danny Ainge has, and then he says, well, no, I want this. If I'm going to trade him, I need 3 firsts, I need this, whatever. Teams need to say, okay, before you even talk to Danny Ainge, you need to say, this is my cutoff point. I'm not giving up more than this for a guy like Mike Conley. And you're going to see it in all the value I have for all these players. The value is relative to the market and relative to what they can give you in the postseason. Mike Conley is not who he was 3-4 years ago when he was worth 2 first-round picks from the Memphis Grizzlies. Significantly not that same player. Now, it's not that he's not good. I still think there's value for him on a playoff team, no question. But you're not giving up 2 first-round picks. You're not giving up a unprotected first-round pick for Mike Conley at this point of his career. You just can't. Now, does a team maybe do it? Possibly, and that's what I'm hedging that this is the value that it should be, not necessarily what will happen. But that's what I think his value should be set at. We get into our next player now here, and it's Colin Sexton. The only team I could really see making a move for him this trade deadline is the Dallas Mavericks, and it would take a future first to go get him. But ultimately, I say he does not get traded. I think the Utah Jazz roll with him into next year. And the Jazz, this is the positives of having 7, I think, valuable players out on the trade block right now, trade market, that you guys can really dictate what happens at the trade deadline. You don't have to trade all of them. You could add a really great collection of assets by only trading 3 of the 7 players, or even 2 of the 7 players could get you some decent assets back, help you lose some more games, kind of set yourself up in lottery position while still keeping most of the roster intact. And then once you go into the draft, you add a couple players in the first round, and hopefully you're back next year with some improvement from Walker Kessler, some improvement from Ochai Agbaji down the stretch of the season, and you're a better team next year just from natural progression of some of your young guys, including maybe Colin Sexton, who's still, I think in his first year back from injury, working back into game shape. And I think he's a player that the Utah Jazz don't mind keeping around long term. If they didn't like him, they wouldn't have given him a 4-year, $71 million contract. The next one now, Jordan Clarkson. Now I got to be careful what I say here, otherwise he's going to square up on me and try and throw a punch, but I'm just playing around. Jordan Clarkson's a really valuable player this trade deadline, especially in a 6th-man role type. Now I know this year for Utah, his role has changed significantly. He's not doing the same things he was back when Donovan and Rudy were there in Utah. He is adjusted and he's played really well. I think his playmaking's taken a step forward, which I think is a positive when it comes to his trade value. A lot of teams should recognize that. And there's 4 teams that really could use a Jordan Clarkson type. The Milwaukee Bucks, I think, is a starting point here. They need another bench scorer, in my opinion. I really like what Javon Carter gives you off the bench. I really like Joe Ingles there as well. To me, though, they just need a little bit of half-court punch for when one of Chris Middleton or Giannis is off the floor. In my eyes, Jordan Clarkson can fit with both of those guys. Drew Holiday, of course, is another nice player. To me, Jordan Clarkson can fit off ball next to Drew. He can fit on ball next to Drew. He can fit off ball next to Middleton. He can fit off ball next to Giannis. You can play him with all 3 of your star players there in Milwaukee. I think he's actually a fantastic fit for them. Now, I think they're more focused on Jay Crowder than they would be Jordan Clarkson, which is why there's other options here too for the Jazz to consider. The Los Angeles Lakers, I definitely do think have interest. Now, a deal to see getting done there is kind of tough. Patrick Beverley makes the money work, but Beverley's already been on the Utah Jazz this year. Does a trade happen again where Beverley gets rerouted back to Utah? Maybe, but I mean, I think the Jazz would want for sure Max Christie and maybe some other assets as well. So, it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough for me to see him going to LA. The Suns, another great option in my opinion. They need some more bench scoring. I could see Landry Shamet being on the move in a deal like this. Maybe Jay Crowder in a 3-team proposition where the Suns get Jordan Clarkson, Jay Crowder goes to the 3rd team, and then maybe assets go to Utah in a deal, which I think would actually work out really well. The Suns moving off of Crowder for Clarkson, I think they would look at that as a positive, just given that Jay Crowder's not playing for them. And then you also look at the fact that the team adding Jay Crowder would have to be pretty happy if they don't have to give up a significant role player, maybe even a slightly negative contract back to Utah to make the money work. And that's why assets in terms of draft picks could go back to Utah in that deal. And then the Minnesota Timberwolves, I think, going into the year, I thought they had their Jordan Clarkson type in terms of what Jalen Noel was supposed to give them this year. I thought he was due for a big step forward. Part of why I believe they were willing to give up some of the players they did in the Rudy Gobert deal was they looked at themselves internally and said, Jaden McDaniels is going to take a big step forward. I think he has. But then they were also kind of banking on Jalen Noel to take that step, and he just hasn't. In fact, he's been struggling this year for the most part. Now he's had some nice games. He's been positive for them certain nights, but also some nights he just doesn't have it and he doesn't give you anything. Jordan Clarkson's going to be a much more consistent bench scorer for you. He's done it in the postseason as well. Now to get him, you're going to have to give up a young player with upside. Maybe Jalen Noel could go back to Utah in this deal. You're going to have to find out a way to make the money work here. That's the trickiest component for Minnesota. But you could also see a collection of maybe 2nd-round picks, an expiring contract to make the money work. There's some stuff in there that Utah, I think, would be willing to be flexible on as long as the total package comes to their liking for Clarkson. Our next player now is actually the combo of Malik Beasley and Jared Vanderbilt, who the Jazz got from Minnesota. And these two have been fantastic for the Utah Jazz. Now, both of these guys come off the bench. Jared Vanderbilt has moved to a permanent bench role after Walker Kessler has, taken the starting center job long term, very deservingly, obviously. But Malik Beasley, he's, again, a very potent three-point shooter. Like I mentioned in the open of this video, he's a fantastic fit to a lot of teams. And then Jared Vanderbilt as well, an athletic four-man who can defend out on the perimeter. Really, really athletic. He's never dead in a play defensively if he's coming from behind as a chase down block guy, or if he's your rotation weak side help defender. He's going to have a good shot at getting his hand on the basketball in terms of blocking a shot. Now, the one thing about him is if you give him a pump fake, he's jumping out of position for sure, which does hurt your team in terms of defensive rebounding, and also just good solid contests around the rim. Of course, some of those big blocks are meaningful, but he also does have a tendency to put himself out of position that way. But the Portland Trailblazers, I think, are a definitive fit, for Jared Vanderbilt. I think that there's ongoing discussions between Portland and Utah at the time I'm recording this, to be honest. From my sources, everything I'm hearing, I think Portland is definitely in on Jared Vanderbilt. But I do think it's possible that these two guys get traded together, which is why other teams that make sense are the Memphis Grizzlies, who could look to consolidate their power forward spot a little bit. You think about them, they have all of their picks. I know their MO has not been trade out some of their players. They like to draft and develop. They do a great job of that there in Memphis. But at some point, I do expect Zach Lyman to make a decision on a buy now move, whether that's now, maybe 2 years from now. I don't exactly know. But at some point, he's going to make a move that's going to help them win in the postseason. I think Malik Beasley would give them a really, really good movement shooter to come off the bench for Desmond Bane. Of course, Bane is their three-point specialist right now. He does a great job maneuvering off of screens, pin down flares. He does some Spain action as well there with Memphis. He does a lot of different stuff. Desmond Bane does. But when he's out of the game, yes, you have Tyus Jones, who I really like. I think just getting one more backcourt guy, it hedges against injury. It gives you another three-point shooter. If you're down in a game, maybe you play Beasley and Desmond Bane together. I know that lineup's not super big, but it's very skilled and three-point oriented. Could help you get back into some games last year. We saw they were very dynamic and dynamite, honestly, when it came to coming back from down big against the Minnesota Timberwolves. But I think against the better teams in the West, you need a little bit more three-point shooting. That's where Beasley could definitely help them. And I think Jared Vanderbilt gives them some athleticism in the front court for when Jaren Jackson Jr. is inevitably in foul trouble, because he likely will be. The Pelicans, Lakers, both teams that I could see sniffing around this as well. When it comes to the Lakers, of course, again, we're going to talk about that Patrick Beverley contract. That's kind of what you need to use to fit in here for a deal. The Pelicans, I think, make some sense as well. Maybe a Najee Marshall swap could make some sense, where Utah gets a lengthy wing who's, I think, honestly having a really great season. Najee Marshall does not deserve or does not receive as much love as he deserves. He's a very nice young player. Now, in terms of making the money work there, again, that's a little bit trickier for the Pelicans' perspective, but maybe a Devontae Graham is the way that they would look at making the money work. But then you're wondering from where the Pelicans are, their recent losing streak. Of course, they did get a win last night over the Lakers, but you look at where they are right now. The Pelicans, they have not been winning a ton of games. Maybe they do need to make a move. Beasley or Vanderbilt could definitely fit the bill for that. And then when it comes to trading these two guys, this is the overall value of what I'm expecting them to look for. And I did not include cap filler here, but of course, for trade rules, you need to make sure you match the money within 125%. So for these two guys, they're going to at least get one first-round pick. I know there's the report going around that, they want a first-round pick for each of them, or first-round pick value for each of them. I don't see them getting two first-round picks from this deal. If they do attach them together or even trade them separately, I'd be kind of surprised by that. Vanderbilt, to me, is not worth a first-round pick. I really like Vando. I do. In fact, I maybe even prefer Vando long-term over Beasley. But Beasley's a little bit more portable when it comes to postseason basketball. If you go back and watch Minnesota last year in the playoffs, Vando at times could not be on the floor. And that was with the team that could really, really shoot the three last year for Minnesota. In the second half of the season, they were the number one ranked offense last season. And Vando just still couldn't fit on the floor a ton. with that team. And, as everybody knew, the Timberwolves were a terrible defensive rebounding team. Vando was a part of that. But I think for these two guys together, you can get a first-round pick, a probable good young player. I think maybe another team that I should have mentioned here, the Denver Nuggets with Bones Highland. Is that a potential option here? Could be. It really could be. I don't hate that. I actually think the Nuggets getting Jared Vanderbilt back. Of course, he was there initially. Tim Conley, who's now in Minnesota, traded him from Denver to Minnesota and then got to Minnesota and traded him from Minnesota to Utah. So clearly, Tim Connolly's not the biggest believer in Jared Vanderbilt, but maybe that Nuggets brass that's still intact there does believe in him. And then maybe a few second-round picks, at least one, maybe two, three. Could be thrown in there. This is equivalent to the value of 2 first-round picks, but I just don't see a team being willing to give up 2 firsts or, 2 teams giving up 1 first. I just think that's, I don't know, with the way that the Stepien rule really impacts the trade process right now and how many teams have what picks, it's hard for me to see a lot of teams being willing to give up a first-round pick for each of these players this trade deadline. Then we'll talk about these 2 players. These are our final 2 players to talk about in terms of suitors and value. I think right now Rudy Gay and Kelly Olynyk are more utilized as cap fillers and small ad pieces into deals to get something done. I know there's reports right now that Boston's really interested in Kelly Olynyk. There's a lot of rumors right now that, Kelly Olynyk could go here. Boston's looking for a center, which I understand they're looking for a little bit more size to present to Giannis and throw at some of the guys in the East like Kevin Durant. You want to have rim protection. You want to have rebounders. All the essentials of winning, right? The one thing is Kelly Olynyk doesn't really give you a lot of those things in terms of rim protection, defense, switching on the perimeter. Olynyk's not a terrible defender, but it's not like he's a, oh my gosh, plus postseason defender that's going to fit exactly what Boston wants to do. Now, offensively, he does, right? He steps out behind the three-point line. He gives them a little bit of a dribble drive threat, which I think could, make Brooklyn pay with what Nick Claxton is going to look to do as a rotation help guy. There's value for Kelly Olynyk for sure. I just don't know if Danny Ainge is willing to part with him for less than a first-round pick, which I know sounds crazy. But given what he did with Bojan Bogdanovic, trading him away, and now what Bojan's value's at, you have to think that Danny Ainge kind of viewed Kelly Olynyk in a similar light of, hey, this guy's good and we want to keep him long-term. Ultimately, I don't think anything happens with Kelly Olynyk. Rudy Gay's contract is most important for the $6 million that he's owed this year and next year in terms of matching money in a deal to get something done if things are close, but they just need to move some salaries around. That's where Rudy Gay's value is this season for the Utah Jazz, trading him away. So projected activity level, and this is one of the most important parts of the video. I think this deadline, you can look at the Utah Jazz as the team that is the new booth at the farmer's market. For anyone who's ever been to a farmer's market, hey, oh, look, there's a new booth set up over there. Let's go over and check out what they're selling. I think that's what Utah's going to do this deadline. For anybody who's been watching these trade guides, I've been saying that there's not a ton of sellers this year. There's a lot of good competitive teams, a lot of teams that view themselves as playoff teams, and especially in the West, there's really not a favorite right now. To me, I still really like Golden State in the postseason. I think that when they shorten their rotation down in the series get going, that I think Golden State could really ascend over a lot of the other teams, especially when you look at how dynamic Steph Curry is with the ball and without it. So, that's the team I prefer, but I don't think that they've blown anyone away this year. And because of that, Utah is one of those teams that could jump into the seller category. There's not a ton of other great sellers. Maybe look at Houston with Eric Gordon, maybe the Spurs with Jakob Poeltl and, Doug McDermott. There's some options, right? Go check out those other trade guides. But again, there's 7 quality players here that the Utah Jazz could look to trade away that could really make a difference in the postseason. I really do believe that at least 5 of those 7 players on that first graphic I showed about their tradable players, I think 5 of those 7 guys for sure could make a difference in the postseason. And I think that there's upside for the other 2. Rudy Gay could have a nice game, right? And maybe score 12 points off the bench and be a positive influence. Now, is it likely? No, but I think it's possible. So I think Utah's really the team to watch when it comes to trading players. I know everyone keeps circling Phoenix and Toronto. I understand it. Toronto's got the higher level players, the OG Anunobys of the world. They got the Van Vliet. They've got the Gary Trent Jr. I get it. The Raptors don't even have a 7-man rotation most nights, to be honest. The Jazz have a 7-man rotation that they're probably willing to trade away. this year, which is why I think that they're really the most intriguing selling team to me. Now, they don't have the high-end OG Anunoby level player. I'll be the first to completely acknowledge that. But, you know, Mike Conley, a Colin Sexton, there's good players here that do have impact. So I think teams are going to definitely have conversations with Utah. And I think Danny Ainge is going to have a lot of fun this trade deadline, picking up the phone, talking about trades. And, you know, he's going to really enjoy his time for sure, I believe. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to leave a like on it. Subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to turn on a notification bell as well, because we are going to be live streaming all NBA trade deadline week long. Remember, a mock draft coming out on the channel as well this week. So there's a lot of stuff happening on the channel in terms of the NBA trade deadline, NBA draft. A lot of great content that I hope you guys do enjoy. Again, smash that like button, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.